Member for Kamloops North Thompson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's interesting, the member opposite must not have his listening ears on today, because we've actually been talking about our plans on Better as Possible, which is addiction and recovery-focused treatment. We've mentioned our housing plan, our Safer BC plan, which would actually have consequences to people breaking laws. And what we've heard back from government is 20 years ago, and oh, well, that's the federal government's fault or problem, or oh, actually, it's a global problem that's happening right now. No actual acknowledgement of the total disarray that has been created over the last 7 years that this government has been in office. And that is the reality that people are faced with every day. When we look at things like their Clean BC plan, which is really, as we see with the BC review, of a government-commissioned report and findings, it's really a cost to BC plan, because that's what it's going to do. It's going to cost British Columbians. So at a time when we see emissions in BC rising, actually worse than they are across Canada, based on the latest information from the federal government, and because the government, this NDP government, didn't like the result of that reporting, it suddenly became a flawed federal government report, according to this NDP government. Because once again, they don't want to be held accountable for their own lack of action and results on a wide range of issues. When it comes to Clean BC, this is the government, this is the Premier that has insisted that regardless of what happens federally with the price of carbon, BC will go to a $170 carbon tax. At a time when all the other premiers are calling for a minimum of freezing, if not outright removal of carbon tax, this Premier has said it's going to $170. Now that includes NDP premiers, it includes NDP opposition leaders across this country that have recognized that people simply can't afford a tax that's not actually delivering the result it was supposed to do, which is drop emissions. Now the government will say, well, you brought in the tax, and yes, we did when we were BC Liberals back in the day. We brought in the tax, emissions were actually dropping. It was revenue neutral. And it was capped at $30. This government came into office and they immediately spiked it to $50, all while watching emissions rise. They removed it being revenue neutral. And then they cheerleaded going to $170, and now they insist they will be the only jurisdiction in the country at $170 carbon tax if the rest of the country drops it. BC United's made it very clear. Federal carbon tax drops to zero, BC drops to zero. That's a very clear statement of what would we do different, to the member opposite if he's wondering what we would do different. We'd actually stand up for people and make sure they get treated the same as Atlantic Canada as it relates to the fuel they're heating their homes with, where that has now been exempted from carbon tax federally for the next 3 years. This government, this Premier, refuses to stand up for British Columbians and demand to be treated on an equal footing like the rest of the country is demanding. So back to Cost BC. It's a plan that this government's own commissioned report very clearly shows by 2030, a $28 billion annual hit to our GDP, driving our economy back to 2013 levels, and costing households $11,000 a year in income. Yes, that's right. It actually shows that incomes will drop by $11,000 a year in their households, hardly making British Columbia affordable for families to live. Another 200,000 or so jobs will be lost, according to the modeling. And the best this government can do is say, oh no, that modeling is not real. We don't believe it. Yeah, you shouldn't look at that. Except they commissioned it. They asked for it. They just didn't like the actual answer. And what the answer actually said was the only way for this government to meet their emissions targets is to shut down the resource sector in British Columbia. We just saw that this weekend up in the north, unfortunately, with the Canfor decision. This government, actually, that fits their Clean BC plan. Keep shutting down mills, keep shutting down natural resource to drive down their emissions. And remember, started off by pointing out emissions are actually going up in British Columbia based on the latest data points that we have generated by the federal government. So this government can try to dismiss their own internal reports all they want, but the bottom line, Mr. Speaker, is emissions are going up. People are being taxed out of their grocery list to have to go to food banks now and this government's not responding. BC United has a very clear plan on how we will respond when it comes to
Thank
those
you,
types
member.
of taxations. Thank you, Mr.
member.
Speaker.